When Callum Hayes placed a bid of $155 on an abandoned hotel that no one else dared touch, CEO Victoria Waverley laughed from across the auction room. She called the single father a dreamer about to bury himself in debt, mold, and crumbling walls. Callum said nothing. He took the rusted key, walked into a building that had been forgotten for 17 years, and found a sealed door beneath the basement floor. 2 months later, billionaire Sebastian Kingsley arrived and placed $22 million on the table. If you believe the person being laughed at can see the treasure others walk past, stay with this. The town of Briar Glen, Colorado, had grown quiet in the way that mountain towns do when the industry that built them pulls back and leaves only the bones behind. The streets still carried names from prosperous decades: Copper Ridge Road, Mill Creek Drive, the wide boulevard running past the old courthouse. But the storefronts along the main strip had thinned over the years until only the essentials remained, and even those wore a cautious look, as though they knew their tenure was not guaranteed. Every spring, the city council met to sort through the growing list of tax-delinquent properties that had gone unpaid for so long the paperwork had stacked into something like archaeology. And every spring, the same decision was made: put them up for auction and let the market decide what they were worth. The auction on a cold Tuesday morning in late October drew about 40 people, which was enough to fill half the folding chairs inside the municipal hall and leave the rest standing against the walls with coffee cups and skeptical expressions. Most of the lots moved quickly: a vacant hardware storefront, 2 parcels of raw land on the eastern slope, a house on Fern Street with a collapsed porch that still had charm if you squinted. And most went for less than their assessed value, which was already low. The auctioneer worked through the list with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to feel the drama in it, and it was only when he reached the last item that the room changed character in a way even the most jaded observer could feel. The Bellwether Grand Hotel stood at the edge of town where the road curved upward toward the higher elevations. A 6-story structure built from hand-dressed stone in the 1920s and closed 17 years ago under circumstances that the city had never fully explained to the public's satisfaction. It had sat empty since then, its windows boarded, its iron entrance gates rusted shut, its famous carved facade weathering through 17 winters with no one to tend it, becoming the kind of landmark that people reference when they want to explain what a place has lost. The auctioneer described the opening bid of $155 with the same flat tone he used for everything, but he spent considerably more time on the attached obligations: nearly $430,000 in outstanding taxes, deferred environmental fees, and disputed remediation costs. A 90-day window to demonstrate the structure's viability before the city could proceed with demolition, full liability for public safety during that period, and a 60-day restriction on resale that prevented any immediate flip. The room stayed absolutely still when he finished reading. No one reached for a bidding paddle. A woman near the back shifted her weight, and the creak of her chair was the loudest sound in the building for a long moment. Several serious developers who had driven up from Denver checked their phones, confirming what they had already decided before the trip. The math did not work, the risk was unlimited, and the building was a liability dressed in historical stone. Victoria Waverley sat in the front row, with the composed attention of someone who had no intention of bidding, but wanted to be present for the record. She was 39 years old, the chief executive of Waverly Crown Resorts, a hospitality company her family had built over 4 decades into one of the most recognized names in Rocky Mountain luxury travel. The Bellwether Grand had once been a Waverly property. Her grandmother had spoken of it at holiday dinners as though it were a dignified old relative who had simply aged out of usefulness. The company's internal report, compiled by the Development Division, characterized the hotel as a bottomless financial pit wrapped in deteriorating masonry, and Victoria had seen no reason to dispute that assessment. She was there, she would tell people later, as a formality, to confirm that Waverly had no further obligation to the property and to sign whatever paperwork the city needed to close the chapter cleanly. Callum Hayes had spent 6 weeks studying the building before the auction, which was longer than any of the developers from Denver had spent, and he had done it methodically. He was 43 years old, a structural restoration engineer who had spent his career assessing old buildings that other people had given up on, though the firm he had built had dissolved 4 years earlier when a chain of contracts fell apart after a municipal funding freeze. Since then, he had taken smaller work, residential repairs, foundation assessments, one careful restoration of a Victorian schoolhouse that had earned him a regional preservation award, and very little money. He lived simply in a rented house at the edge of Briar Glen with his daughter Emery, who was 20 and studying architectural conservation at a university 2 hours away, and he had developed the habit of looking at broken structures the way a diagnostician looks at a patient. Not at what was obviously wrong, but at what was fundamentally intact. What Callum saw when he studied the Bellwether Grand from the outside, and from publicly available site maps, and from the archived building permits at the county recorder's office, was that the damage concentrated in the additions, the 1970s annex, the ground floor retail conversion, the rear expansion that had been completed cheaply and had aged accordingly. The original stone structure, the bones that the first builders had set in place a century ago, showed no sign of catastrophic failure. He had also noticed on the county parcel map a gap in the boundary description. A section labeled Parcel 14B appeared in the original 1928 survey, but was absent from every modern map. He wrote it in his notebook with a question mark and said nothing to anyone. He raised his paddle at $155, and no one else moved, and the gavel came down before the silence had time to become uncomfortable. Victoria Waverly turned in her chair and looked at him with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a mistake too large to fully absorb. She said, loud enough for the row around her to hear, that she hoped the man had enough money left to buy a new front door for his purchase, because based on what she had seen of the building, that was about all the renovation it would support. Several investors near the back laughed, and one made a remark about the wisdom of purchasing what an organization worth billions had thrown away. Callum accepted the paperwork from the auctioneer, tucked it under his arm, and said, without raising his voice or turning to address anyone in particular, that sometimes a person walks away from a place not because the place has no value, but because they have run out of patience to see it. The city inspector handed him a 3-inch file of obligations before he left the building, and inside the cover page was a property summary that included a parcel map. The modern boundary lines for the Bellwether Grand did not include Parcel 14B. Callum entered the hotel for the first time as its owner on a Wednesday morning with a flashlight, a respirator, a notepad, and a set of tools worn smooth from years of use. The lobby was exactly what 17 years of abandonment produces in a high-elevation building with no climate control. Plaster fallen from the ceiling in sheets, windows behind the boards broken and admitting cold air in thin whistles, furniture reduced to shapes under rotted upholstery. The marble front desk still standing but filmed with grime so thick it had taken on the appearance of stone. He moved through the space with the particular kind of attention that separates a structural assessment from a first impression, tapping walls, pressing the toe of his boot against the baseboards, crouching to examine the floor joists through gaps in the subfloor where boards had given way. What he found was different from what the city's remediation report had described, and different in a direction that mattered. The primary beams. the ones running the full length of the building and carrying the load from 6 floors above, were intact, their old-growth timber dense and dry in the way that wood becomes when it has had a century to cure and has been kept out of standing water. The eastern stone wall, which the report had flagged as structurally compromised, showed hairline cracking only in the mortar joints of the 1950s pointing work layered over the original, a cosmetic failure that communicated nothing about the structural capacity beneath it. The elevator shaft was filled with rust and broken cable, but the shaft walls were plumb and solid. The copper plumbing had been stripped at some point, likely by salvagers, but the cast iron drain lines running beneath the slab floor were intact and, based on the flow he could detect by removing a floor-level access panel, still functioning. Emery drove up that weekend and helped her father photograph and digitize the original architectural drawings they had obtained from the State Historical Archive. She was practical and organized in the way that people become when they grow up watching a parent navigate genuine uncertainty, and she had assisted Callum on enough assessments to read a drawing competently. She pointed out that the labor estimates in the city's report appeared to assume full-gut renovation pricing for work that could be accomplished with targeted repair, and she started a spreadsheet that separated the stabilization costs from the full restoration costs, which were two very different numbers. She was also quietly concerned about the timeline. 90 days was not a large window to satisfy a city that had been trying to be rid of this building for nearly 2 decades. Callum told her he did not need to restore the hotel to save it. He needed to demonstrate that it was restorable, which was a different and smaller task. File for historic preservation status, show the structural assessments, satisfy the safety conditions, and give the city a documented reason to extend rather than demolish. The distinction was the kind his daughter understood because she had watched him draw it before, in buildings that looked defeated until someone looked at them correctly. May Dorsey came to the hotel on the 3rd day because she had heard about the sale and could not stay away. She was 72 years old and had worked the front desk of the Bellwether Grand for 11 years before the closure, and she carried the history of the place the way people carry things that were important to them during a formative period, not as pure sentiment, but as something with weight and texture. She told Callum about the mineral springs, a natural source of warm, lightly sulfurous water that had been the hotel's original draw in the 1920s and 30s. When guests came from Denver and beyond for the therapeutic baths, the hotel operated below the ground floor. She said that after the flood in 1971, the boiler room complex that housed the mineral works had been sealed off. Officially because of silt contamination, unofficially, she believed, because the cost of cleaning it out was too high and the insurance claim was easier to file if the damage was declared total. All the records related to the mineral operations had disappeared from the hotel files before the closure, and she had never been certain whether they had been removed deliberately or simply lost. Callum found a partial floor plan rolled inside a steel blueprint tube in a maintenance closet, brittle with age but legible. It showed the original lower level in enough detail to trace the pipe runs, and one set of pipes ran laterally away from the boiler room toward the rear of the property and continued off the edge of the paper at the precise point where the drawing had been torn. He spent a careful hour in the basement, reading the walls the way he read buildings, as a text written over time by different hands, and he found what he had half expected, a section of brick in the far northeast corner of the sub-basement that did not match the surrounding masonry in age, composition, or bond pattern. It had been built into an existing opening. Someone had sealed a door. The sealed wall sat directly beneath the section of the property where parcel 14B should have been, and on the steel surface behind the brick was stenciled a line that answered one question and opened several more. Bellwether Mineral Works, Authorized personnel only. Callum contacted Nolan Beckett the next morning. Nolan was 47 years old and had practiced real estate and land rights law in Briar Glen for 20 years, long enough to have handled several of the transactions that had transferred the Bellwether Grand between owners over the decades. He had heard about Callum's purchase with the mix of amusement and mild concern that a small-town attorney feels when a person he considers reasonable makes what appears to be an unreasonable decision. But he had been careful not to say so directly, because he had learned that Callum tended to have reasons for things that were not apparent until later. Callum told him about the brick wall, the floor plan, and the missing parcel designation, and Nolan drove to the hotel that afternoon. They agreed that before anything behind the sealed wall was moved or documented, they would proceed through a proper legal protocol. A notarized inventory, a witness, and photographic documentation beginning before the first brick was disturbed. Nolan brought a paralegal named Grace, who was methodical and thorough, and together the three of them documented the removal of a 3-foot section of brick from the lower left corner of the sealed opening to reveal what was behind it. There was no gold. What the room contained was a metal shelving unit with corroded fasteners still holding its shape, and on the shelves, folded geological survey documents in waxed paper envelopes. Hand-drawn pipeline maps annotated in pencil with depth measurements and flow rates, temperature logbooks covering 40 continuous years of mineral spring readings, a bound legal document in a red cover that turned out to be a certified copy of the original property deed from 1928, a tin box containing transfer instruments from 3 subsequent ownership changes, and a set of architectural drawings showing an underground access tunnel running from the hotel's sub-basement beneath Parcel 14B toward a hillside opening approximately 300 yards to the north. The geological surveys described a natural mineral spring formation of meaningful size, consistent with a long-term commercial water source, and the flow rate records showed no significant decline over the decades they covered. The deed was the most important document in the room. Its legal description of the property's rights extended well beyond the building itself. The original conveyance included the perpetual right to extract and use the mineral spring water for commercial and therapeutic purposes, the exclusive right to control the access corridor through Parcel 14B, the right to restrict adjacent property development from using the spring's watershed drainage without a formal agreement, and sole legal access to the northern valley through the corridor, the tunnel created during winter months, when the surface route was impassable. Nolan read the deed twice, set it down, and said that these rights might have been extinguished by one of the subsequent transfers, or severed and recorded separately, and that he would need time to trace the chain of title carefully before any of this could be relied upon. Callum agreed, and the documents were photographed, inventoried, and removed to Nolan's office under the notarized record they had created before the wall was opened. He did not discuss the discovery with anyone else, and did not respond to the local journalist who had left 3 messages about the auction story. He was waiting because the weight of a discovery is determined entirely by whether the paperwork behind it is solid, and he had learned that lesson expensively and did not intend to forget it. 3 days later, an offer arrived by email from a limited liability company called Ridge Asset Solutions. The offer was $80,000 for the Bellwether Grand in its current condition, no contingencies, 30-day close. Callum declined. 24 hours after that, a second email arrived from the same address increasing the offer to $250,000, which was still well below any number the mineral rights and corridor access could justify if confirmed. The escalation told Callum more than the offer itself. Someone else already knew what the room contained or had strong reason to believe the room existed, and they were moving quickly because they understood the same timeline he did. The registered agent for Ridge Asset Solutions shared a business address in Denver with the law firm that represented Everett Voss. The story of a single father purchasing an abandoned hotel for $155 had circulated through the regional media by the end of the first week, framed primarily as a curiosity, an eccentric bet, or a touching display of optimism, depending on the outlet. The consensus read was that Callum Hayes would spend his savings trying to meet the city's conditions, fail before the 90 days were up, and lose the property along with whatever he had invested. Victoria Waverly had not issued any public statement, but her name appeared in several of the stories because of the Waverly family's historical connection to the hotel, and the juxtaposition of the single father's $155 bid against the backdrop of the family's resort empire was the kind of detail that stories about class and aspiration are built from. She came to the hotel with Everett Voss on a Thursday afternoon, nominally to assess whether the publicity was creating any reputational exposure for the Waverly brand. But she walked through the lobby with the focused attention of someone who is seeing a physical space for the first time despite having seen it in reports many times before. Everett stayed close and maintained a running commentary designed to shape what Victoria was observing. The ceiling was unstable. The plaster repairs Callum had completed were cosmetic. The structural report Callum had submitted to the preservation office was optimistic to the point of misrepresentation, and the entire enterprise was built on the Waverly name's news value. He implied without stating it directly, already spoken with contacts at the city about accelerating the demolition review. Victoria listened, but moved through the space differently than Everett expected. She stopped at the base of the restored staircase, where Callum had reinforced the newel posts and replaced 2 broken risers with matched salvage lumber. She looked at the lobby ceiling, where a contractor had applied hydraulic cement to stop the water infiltration that had been destroying the upper plasterwork. She noted the temporary electrical panel that had restored lighting to the main floor, and the safety barriers installed at every point flagged as a fall hazard. Callum was working on the second floor when they arrived and came down when he heard voices. He acknowledged Victoria without warmth but without hostility, the manner of someone who has noted a debt and chosen not to collect it immediately. Victoria asked him directly why a building that Waverly's own engineers had assessed at over $18 million in restoration costs appeared to be making visible progress on what was clearly a fraction of that budget. Callum pulled the marked-up version of the Waverly assessment from the site binder he carried and walked her through a dozen line items. A seismic reinforcement charge applied to a building that already exceeded the applicable code requirements for its construction era. Waterproofing costs calculated at the rate for a new build membrane system on a foundation whose original drainage had only needed clearing. Full roof replacement costs applied to a slate field where fewer than 20% of the individual slates had actually failed. The total stabilization cost, using only what was demonstrably necessary, could be accomplished for under $2 million. Victoria photographed 2 pages of the marked-up assessment without asking permission, and Everett suggested, with audible tension in his voice, that they needed to leave for another appointment. Before she left, Victoria paused at the wall of framed historical photographs that Callum had cleaned and rehung in the lobby as part of his case for historic designation. In the middle row was a formal portrait from the hotel's 1930 opening celebration, a line of dignitaries and guests standing in front of the mineral bath entrance. The woman in the center wore a fur-trimmed collar and held a small bouquet, and her face was familiar to Victoria from family portraits in the Waverly estate. Eleanor Waverly, her great-grandmother, who had been present at the opening and had never, in any of the family narratives Victoria had grown up with, been described as having any connection to the mineral works below the hotel. Everett had her out the front door and into the car before she could ask Callum about the photograph. And that evening, back in her Denver office, Victoria submitted an internal request to the company's records archive for all historical files relating to the Bellwether Grand. 3 days later, the archivist reported that a significant section of the Bellwether file had been deleted from the document management system 8 months earlier, logged under Everett Voss's credentials. The deleted records included the mineral rights documentation. In the metadata, she found the email, a message from Everett to an address she did not recognize, written 14 months earlier, instructing the recipient not to include mineral access rights in any property valuation and to ensure the asset was removed from the company portfolio FAO before the following quarter's review. Callum had less than 4 weeks remaining on his 90-day window when the pressure from multiple directions arrived at once. He hired an independent structural engineer named Roger Walsh, who drove up from Pueblo and spent 2 full days inside the building, producing a report that contradicted the city's emergency demolition assessment point by point, with photographic evidence and load calculations attached. A crew of 8 local workers, 4 of them laid-off construction tradespeople who had been waiting for any project in the valley to resume, agreed to work at reduced rates in exchange for the right to be hired first when the full restoration began, if it did, and they moved through the building with the focused energy of people who understand that the work itself is a form of argument. Emery came for a long weekend and worked alongside her father on the technical documentation, and it was during that visit, while tracing the tunnel route on the old survey drawings, that she noted something that had not appeared in any of the documents Callum had reviewed. The tunnel did not only provide access to the mineral spring, its terminus on the hillside opened onto the only graded route into the northern valley that remained passable when the main road was buried under winter snowpack, which in the mountains east of Briar Glen ran to 4 and 5 months of the year. Sebastian Kingsley had been developing that valley for 3 years. His project, a wellness resort built around principles of integrated landscape immersion that his company had made internationally recognized, was in the final phase of permitting, with a construction budget that the regional business press had placed at over $600 million. Callum had not connected the project to the tunnel access until Emery made the note. He knew of Kingsley heritage and wellness the way anyone in Colorado knew it, as a name attached to exceptional properties in exceptional places, but the valley north of Briar Glen had not been publicly associated with any specific development announcement until a permit filing appeared in the county records the same week Emery was studying the survey. The winter access problem had not been included in any of the public filings because everyone who worked in mountain construction understood that a company of Kingsley's scale simply would not have proceeded this far without addressing something so fundamental. Everett had told Sebastian at some point during their preliminary discussions that he would provide the access. He had not yet delivered because the building that controlled it had been inconveniently purchased by a man with a flashlight and a notebook who had noticed a gap in a parcel map. The emergency structural assessment that appeared from the city inspector's office 2 weeks before Callum's deadline was filed under an expedited review that Nolan had never seen invoked for a building of this type. The report concluded that new evidence had been presented suggesting imminent collapse risk and recommended immediate demolition proceedings. Roger Walsh's independent report, filed the same week, reached the opposite conclusion using the same building and more comprehensive measurements. The city was being asked to choose between them, and Everett had cultivated enough connections on the city council to make that choice something other than straightforward. Victoria was reviewing the internal evidence against Everett and had not yet decided what to do with it. She knew that if she presented it internally, Rosalind would attempt to contain the damage in a way that preserved the company's position rather than corrected the record, and she was aware that Everett had the board relationships to make her own removal look like a leadership transition rather than a response to his exposure. Nolan received the preliminary title confirmation the same afternoon the emergency assessment was filed. The mineral rights and corridor access had never been formally severed from the Bellwether Grand title. Every transfer had carried the complete bundle of rights forward, including the last one, which was the auction on a cold Tuesday morning at $155. A man arrived at the hotel as Callum was reviewing that news, wearing a canvas jacket that gave no indication of who he was, and driving a vehicle that was not the kind a billionaire uses when he wants to be identified. He walked through the front doors, looked at the restored lobby with an expression Callum could not immediately read, and introduced himself without preamble as Sebastian Kingsley. Sebastian did not use diplomatic approach or preparation time. He sat down at the work table Callum had set up in the old dining room, looked at the survey maps and structural drawings spread across its surface, and explained his situation with the directness of a man who had learned that straightforwardness costs less than maneuvering when the other person is already holding the relevant documents. His resort project was endangered by two interlinked problems he had believed were solved before they turned out to be contingent on a transaction that had never been completed. The primary access route was impassable from November through March, roughly the period when a wellness resort most needed to be reachable, since the clientele he was building for treated winter as the peak season. His hydrological consultant had identified the Bellwether spring system as the only reliable water source with sufficient volume and mineral content to support the therapeutic programming the resort's concept required. He had been in preliminary discussions with a representative of a company that claimed to be positioned to convey those rights, and those discussions had continued for over a year without producing a document he could execute. And he had eventually commissioned his own title research, which had led him to a man standing in a century-old building with geological surveys on the table. The offer was $22 million in cash, payable within 60 days of closing, for the Bellwether Grand and Parcel 14B in their entirety. Sebastian said he had considered lower figures and decided the premium was appropriate because Callum had demonstrated something his own acquisition team had failed to do. He had found and verified the rights that made the property worth discussing at all. He gave Callum 48 hours to respond. The news moved faster than Callum had anticipated. A regional business reporter had the figure in print within 18 hours. The single father who had purchased the abandoned hotel for $155 had received a $22 million offer from one of the most prominent resort developers in the western United States. The people who had laughed at the auction began recalibrating publicly and privately. Two investors who had been in the municipal hall that morning called to discuss partnership opportunities. Victoria Waverly sat in her Denver office and read the story and understood, in the particular way that intelligent people understand things they have been avoiding, that she had laughed at the wrong moment in the right room. Rosalind Waverly called her before 10 that morning and instructed her to find outside litigation counsel, arguing that the mineral rights had not been disclosed in the public auction notice and that the city had sold a materially different asset than what was advertised. Nolan received the formal legal notice by close of business and told Callum the argument was weak, but that weak arguments filed by well-funded counsel had a way of consuming enough time to expire a deadline. Victoria had not called Rosalind's counsel. She had instead sent a message to Callum asking to meet. At the hotel, Victoria walked through the restored lobby and stopped again at Eleanor Waverley's face in the 1930 portrait, and Callum let her stand there for a moment without speaking. When she asked about the mineral spring documentation, he confirmed he had found it after the auction and not before, and told her that Nolan had already filed an advisory with the State Land Office 3 weeks earlier, long before Sebastian Kingsley had arrived. Dispersed and independently verified. Victoria said she knew about the email. Callum asked which one. She said she thought he probably understood. He said he did not need her to choose him. He needed her to decide what kind of leader she intended to be. Victoria left the hotel that evening and drove directly to the company's general counsel. She requested a board meeting for the following week. When Rosalind called that night to discuss legal strategy, Victoria told her that she would be presenting certain internal communications to the board before any external action was filed, because the external action was based on a position that the internal communications would directly contradict. At the board meeting, Victoria placed Everett's files on the table, walked through the evidence of the suppressed mineral rights documentation, the shell company registration, and the falsified access logs showing Callum's credentials attached to downloads that had occurred after the auction closed. Before the room could respond with the institutional caution that boards used to buy time, she said, they had not lost the Bellwether Grand to Callum Hayes. They had lost it to a man in the room who had been running a private acquisition scheme inside their own company for years, and the laughter at the auction had been their last opportunity to notice. The city scheduled a public hearing to determine whether the auction should be invalidated. The municipal hall filled past capacity on the morning of the hearing, and a contingent of Briar Glen residents who had not attended the original auction were present in numbers. Their interest generated by weeks of regional coverage that had made the Bellwether Grand into a story about what kind of town Briar Glen was becoming. Rosalind Waverley testified first, presenting the argument that the mineral access rights had constituted a material omission in the public auction notice, and that the $155 sale price was facially inadequate for a property whose actual value was demonstrably in the millions. She was measured and precise and carried the authority of a woman who had exercised power in a regional industry for so long that authority had become a physical quality she projected without effort. Nolan responded by entering into the record the Waverley Company's own internal communications from the period when the hotel was removed from the portfolio. 3 separate board minutes in which the company affirmed the hotel had no commercial value, 2 letters to the city stating that Waverley declined to pay outstanding tax obligations, and a letter signed by Rosalind herself authorizing the final surrender of the property to city jurisdiction. He also entered the testimony of the city assessor, who confirmed that the parcel map discrepancy had been present in all public auction documents, and that any bidder performing standard due diligence would have had access to the same publicly filed surveys Callum had used. Callum testified about his process, speaking without notes because the sequence was clear in his mind. He had observed the building's exterior condition during repeated visits over 6 weeks prior to the auction. He had obtained all survey and permit documents from public filing offices. He had noted the parcel 14B discrepancy in public records and treated it as a question rather than a conclusion. He had discovered the sealed room only after taking possession. He had immediately engaged legal counsel before opening or removing anything. And he had submitted the preliminary deed findings to the State Land Office before any offer was received from any party. He had not known about the $22 million potential when he raised his paddle. He had known about a gap in a parcel map and a building whose bones were better than its reputation. Victoria presented the internal documents, the email to the anonymous address, the deletion log, the false access records, and the shell company registration filed 6 weeks before the auction. The clearest evidence that the suppression of the mineral rights documentation had been deliberate and planned well in advance. Everett's counsel offered the defense that he had acted to protect Waverley's interests in a difficult asset situation. Sebastian Kingsley appeared as the final witness, took the seat with the unhurried manner of a man entirely comfortable in formal settings, and explained that the $22 million figure reflected the specific value that the bellwether rights held for his project in the Northern Valley, value that would not exist for a general buyer, that had not existed when the city conducted the auction, and that existed now only because his development had matured to the point where access and water rights had become the decisive constraints. The hotel was not worth $22 million to everyone in the room. It was worth a specific extraordinary sum to one buyer under one set of circumstances, and those circumstances had not existed until after the gavel came down. This explained, clearly and without ambiguity, why the city and every other investor present on the morning of the auction had not seen what Callum saw. The council deliberated for 90 minutes and confirmed the auction. The sale of the Bellwether Grand to Callum Hayes for $155, together with all appurtenant rights and obligations as described in the original legal conveyance, was valid and final. Everett was suspended pending a fraud investigation that the State Attorney General's office indicated it would pursue. Victoria's board was informed by a letter from 6 major institutional shareholders that her removal in connection with her testimony would prompt a special governance meeting. Rosalind did not force the issue. When Callum stepped out of the municipal hall, Victoria was standing on the sidewalk, not with the crowd and not quite alone, in the posture of someone who has made a costly decision and has not yet decided whether to be at peace with it. Callum said he was sorry about what it had cost her. She said she was not sure yet that she was sorry, which was different from saying she was fine. Sebastian returned to the hotel 2 days after the hearing with a revised proposal. The $22 million figure remained, but its structure had changed entirely from a purchase price to an investment framework, redrawn in response to a counterproposal Callum had sent by email the morning after the initial offer. The terms took 3 weeks to finalize and were reviewed by Nolan and by a Denver firm specializing in historic property partnerships, but the essential structure held. Kingsley Heritage and Wellness would invest $22 million in the restoration of the Bellwether Grand, distributed across 4 construction phases, with each release contingent on meeting preservation benchmarks. Callum would retain majority voting control over the hotel's operations and design decisions. Kingsley would receive a long-term but non-perpetual right to use the Parcel 14B corridor for resort access, renewable under defined conditions. Mineral spring use would be governed by an environmental stewardship agreement developed with the State Water Authority. All hiring for the restoration and ongoing operations would prioritize Briar Glen residents, and a dedicated fund drawn from a percentage of annual revenue would finance long-term maintenance of the spring ecosystem. The document was 31 pages and contained no clause that allowed the corridor or water rights to pass permanently out of the Bellwether's ownership. If Kingsley ever violated the stewardship terms, the access rights would revert in full. Victoria was removed from the CEO position temporarily while the board processed the implications of her testimony. Several major institutional shareholders wrote a second letter indicating that if the removal became permanent on the basis of her having told the truth at a public hearing, they would request a special governance session. The board ultimately confirmed her reinstatement with a mandate to implement a reformed structure across the development division. She did not announce this as an achievement. She implemented it and moved forward. Callum had extended an invitation for Victoria to join the Bellwether Restoration Project in an advisory capacity, sending it through Nolan's office as a formal consulting arrangement with no special terms and no reference to their shared history. She declined the consulting arrangement and asked whether the project would be hiring a restoration coordinator through an open process. Callum said it would. She applied. She was offered the position and accepted it, without asking for any accommodation that acknowledged what she had walked away from to be present at the beginning of the work. On the day, Callum moved the first phase of construction documents to the hotel to begin work in earnest. Victoria found him standing in the lobby, looking at the wall of photographs. She told him she owed him an apology. Not the kind delivered at a hearing for the record, but the kind that belongs in the place where the original action occurred. She said she had laughed because she had believed, with the particular confidence of someone surrounded by people paid to confirm her understanding of the world, that a man without institutional resources could not possibly see something her analysts had missed. Callum accepted the apology in the manner of a person who has not been carrying a grievance. He told her the mockery had been wrong, not because the hotel turned out to be worth millions, but because no person's bet on an overlooked thing deserves contempt before the hand is played. 18 months after the auction, the Bellwether Springs Hotel opened for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And it opened as something that the original building would have recognized as kin. The stone lobby stood as it had been built, cleaned and pointed but not replastered, its hand-dressed walls carrying the record of a century in every variation of color and texture. The main staircase had been fully restored using matched salvage materials documented through the State Historic Preservation Archive, and the mineral bath facility occupied the original lower level, its pools finished in the same pale ceramic tile specified in the 1930 drawings, its water flowing from the spring at a temperature and mineral content that May Dorsey, standing at the edge of the restored pool on opening day, said she remembered from her first winter working at the front desk. The steel door at the base of the sub-basement corridor had been kept in place, cleaned, oiled, and fitted with proper hardware, and the room behind it had been opened into a small permanent exhibition about the hotel's history, the spring's geology, and the documentary record that had been preserved inside it for decades, waiting for someone to look at a wall and ask why the bricks did not match. The opening created 240 local jobs, which was the number the Economic Development Office had estimated, and which turned out to be accurate. The tourism figures for Briar Glen showed the hotel's first winter season driving occupancy across every other accommodation in town above any level recorded in the previous 15 years. Sebastian's Valley Resort opened its first phase the following spring, reached by a seasonal road maintained under the access agreement, with guests arriving in the colder months through the tunnel corridor that Callum had documented and Nolan had secured. The 2 properties served adjacent visions of what a mountain stay could be, and the valley became the kind of destination that required advanced planning. Emery completed her degree and joined the restoration team as a full project member through the same application process as everyone else, which was the arrangement she had insisted on, and her father had accepted without argument. Victoria held her position at Waverly Crown Resorts differently than she had before. She spent the Bellwether contract months living out of a hotel room in Briar Glen. A decision she told no one was deliberate, because she wanted to be present for the work in the way that presence changes how a person understands something, which is different from being consulted from a distance. Her relationship with Callum developed in the way that things develop between people who have established respect through conflict. Slowly, with more honesty than comfort, neither of them in a hurry to define what the next thing should be, and both of them aware that what they had already built together was real in a way that required no rush. At the opening ceremony, a reporter from a regional television station asked Callum whether it was the mineral rights, the corridor access, or the $22 million investment that had proved to be the most valuable thing hidden inside the Bellwether Grand. He walked the reporter to the restored front desk, where a glass-fronted display case had been mounted beside the original brass mail slots, and inside the case were three objects: a numbered auction paddle, 47, a rusted brass room key on a leather fob, and a receipt from the municipal auction office showing a payment of $155. He said that the most valuable thing he had found was not below the basement floor. It was in the moment when a person decides to trust what they can see with their own eyes, when everyone around them is certain there is nothing worth seeing. Victoria stood a few feet back in the crowd of staff and guests who had gathered for the ceremony, and she remembered the sound she had made in the auction room, the brief, assured laugh of someone confident in her position, and she felt it in the particular way you feel a thing when you are standing in the building that outlasted it. When Callum finished speaking, she was the first to start the applause. 2 months earlier, the room had filled with laughter because a man had paid $155 for a ruin. Now that same laughter had given way to something entirely different, because everyone present understood that he had not bought a broken hotel at all. He had bought back the future that the powerful had been too proud to imagine.
Oh, wow. Only one phase, right? Oh, wow. Shit. Damn. Let attack so you can do more damage. You won't have a lot of chances to get your heavies in. Let attacks. Oh, okay. Copy that. Okay. Second try. We got it. That guy can teleport? Yeah. Makes it a little bit more difficult.
Why so eager to